I'm very high needs. I need my hot tea and my cold water. I'm fighting a cold, and since I don't have a mic, I'll do my best to project, but if you can't hear me, raise a hand or let me know, and I'll do my best to adjust. So I think I've managed to even at least briefly meet with everybody in the room. It's just so nice. It's such a pleasure to be here with everybody, and I just really appreciate everyone's warmth. Yeah, it's so wonderful to just be in a room with people having just met you, and to feel some basic connection sort of right from the get-go. And that's a good platform for exploring this way of being with others that we'll be talking about and kind of tasting, hopefully, a little bit that Hanifa mentioned, which we call basic attendance. And to help us further get a sense of who's the room, I thought I would start with a question. And the question is, how many of us have had the experience, Phoebe's heard this question, but I think only Phoebe has. How many of us have had the experience of becoming so absorbed in some kind of thought or fantasy or welling up of emotion and sort of inner drama that we, at least briefly, lose contact with our immediate surroundings? So it could be as simple as we're driving down the highway and we hear something on the radio that sparks a thought, or we start thinking about an argument we had at work, and our mind is completely enveloped by these images and thoughts and feelings in a kind of churning, and miles go by, and suddenly we realize, oh, how did I get here? Maybe we missed the turn, or maybe we took the turn and made it all the way home, but don't really remember taking the turn. Anybody had an experience like that?
You mean today, right?
Right, yeah. So that's good to know, right? And how many of us have come back? Yeah. Right, so that's good news. Like, we're all human. We all have these capacities to become immersed in a kind of inner experience that kind of takes over and eclipses what's happening around us, our connection with others, our connections with the physical environment. And we all have the capacity to return to being here and making contact with our fellow human beings and the environment we find ourselves in. And those two capacities are capacities that we share with everybody we work with, everybody we relate with. And that's an important underpinning for this whole approach, that no matter how intensely somebody may be absorbed in their inner experience and their thoughts, feelings, compulsions, projections, whatever kind of language we might use to describe that, we all have moments of coming back like that. I really appreciate the voice who joined us in the beginning.
Why?
That was fortuitous. Because, and hopefully we'll get more into this, but kind of the whole premise of this talk is about how can we gradually expand our capacity to invite and be with whatever arises in our experience, so that we can show up more fully for others. And mindfulness is one really wonderful tool for that, and there maybe other tools and other practices people do to cultivate that. And whatever practice we find or support we find in order to increase that capacity to be with whatever is arising for us and whatever is arising around us can be I feel there's this impulse to say, oh, it's such a gift to others or something, but it's really a gift to ourselves, and then by extension, hopefully benefits others as well. So that's what basic attendance is about. But to provide a little more context, and Hanifa talked a little bit about Windhorse, I wanted to just speak briefly to the history of the Windhorse approach and the context that basic attendance at Windhorse typically happens in, and then really try to spend most of the time around how might a kind of interpersonal or relational mindfulness practice in a variety of settings benefit or be relevant to all sorts of situations, particularly where we're intending to be of support to another person. But just to get a sense of the roots and the context, the founder of Windhorse was a psychoanalytically trained psychiatrist named Ed Podville. He wrote a book called The Seduction of Madness, which isn't the title he came up with, but the publisher thought it was like sexier or something. So they called it The Seduction of Madness, and then later put out a revised version called Recovering Sanity. So if you buy it new, that would be the title. And he received his psychoanalytic training at a place called Chestnut Lodge, which in the 40s, around the 40s, 50s maybe, was one of the very few places working with people in really more extreme states of mind, like psychosis, in a thoroughly psychoanalytic approach. And the view that a lot of people's difficulties in those states had relational roots and could be worked through or ameliorated to some extent by how other people are relating to them. Particularly inspired by the work of Frida von Reichmann and the people who studied with her. And so Ed Podville received his training there from people who were trained by Frida von Reichmann. He also spent time at Austin Riggs. When he left Chestnut Lodge, he worked at Austin Riggs. And then eventually met the Tibetan Buddhist teacher Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who founded the Shambhala community as well as Naropa Institute, now Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado, which was the first Buddhist university, at least in North America, possibly outside of Asia. And Ed co-founded with Trungpa Rinpoche, which means he basically founded what became the Contemplative Psychotherapy Program, a master's program at Naropa, informed by Buddhist teachings as well as Ed's psychoanalytic training. And then out of the Naropa program, Ed began working with graduate students to support people who were recovering from psychosis and actually bringing them out of the hospital in Boulder and helping them recover in a household environment in the surrounding community. And through a lot of experimentation and informed by the Buddhist teachings and practices that they all shared, they developed what has become the Windhorse approach. So that's there. And to be kind of try to be pithy about some of the aspects of it, there's the mindfulness informed, which I'm going to spend a lot of time on, and I'm really going to emphasize the kind of contemplative underpinnings of this. We could also focus more on the relational aspects, and that could be a whole other avenue, and that'll be there to some extent, but in some ways I'm emphasizing how the contemplative aspects inform being in relationship. Team-based, that each person was supported by a team of people. So nowadays in Northampton, a full team might include the psychotherapist, a wellness nurse, a team leader, and a housemate, and a couple of counselors, and 3 people on that team. The team leader and the 2 counselors would be doing what's called basic attendance. So hopefully by the end you'll know what I'm talking about. With that, but that's just to give some context that at Windhorse that's done in the setting of a team of people doing it. And there's kind of a formal way of doing that. And at the same time, I would suggest that the underlying qualities could be brought into any situation regardless of your context. And community integrated is this idea of that you're not in a residential situation particularly, that you're actually living in an apartment, you know, down the street from the drugstore, and other people live in your apartment building, and you're in the midst of community life. So, as Hanifa may have said, or I guess whether you said it or not, basic attendance is really the heart and soul of this approach in many ways. And even people who aren't doing formal basic attendance, and even, you know, our administrators, it's a kind of value that we hold and all aspire to work with and embody. And I'll say, having worked at Windhorse, it's something that I try to bring into the rest of my life as well. And there are different ways of thinking about that phrase, basic attendance. One way of thinking about it is that it's tuning into what is basic, what is fundamental to all forms of human care and support and attending to others. And from a contemplative perspective, the real root of what is basic is our inherent goodness and sanity and tender-heartedness that we all share as human beings. That we all have this capacity to be present to another and to be impacted in one way or another by others. That even that sense of feeling, whatever we feel when we hear somebody yelling outside the window, whether it's irritation or delight, that there's a human sensitivity and reverberation that we all share that is inherently good. If we can tune into it, and if it has the right conditions to support it coming forward and kind of blossoming, and that basic sanity is again something we share with all the people we work with. So it's present regardless of our state of mind. That it's always there, and that there are actually, even in the depths of a very intensely distressing and absorbing sort of inner realm that might be called something like psychosis, even in the depths of something like that, there are moments where this kind of clarity or openness or compassion shine through. It could be that you know, the person, I've been on a basic attendance shift with somebody and taking a hike on a mountain, and the person is just ruminating, and I wonder if he even knows I'm there, you know, about how terrible his life's been and how there's really no possibility of things ever changing. And then he noticed a turtle, and it was like, oh, look at that turtle. And then suddenly we're like there, curious about the turtle. And I hadn't noticed the turtle. He had to point it out to me, actually. And if we can tune into that quality of clarity and tenderness and presence within ourselves, then we can notice it in others. And, you know, it can be like a tuning fork, where if one fork is vibrating, then the other starts to vibrate. And sometimes we're the vibrating fork, and sometimes the other person is the vibrating fork. But if we're not paying attention, those moments are easily lost. So that's one way of thinking about basic attendance, tuning into what's basic in our capacity, our basic human capacity to attend to others, the way everybody in this room was attended to as a helpless infant, or we wouldn't be here. Somewhere along the way we got enough to make it this far. So that often begs the question, so what gets in the way? Why is it hard, right? And I'll say too, so I mentioned that there's a way I'm going to emphasize the contemplative perspective. There's also a way that I'm going to emphasize us sort of minding our business as people who are aspiring to support others, and looking at it from what's our work, what can we be working on, rather than what does the other person need to do? Because there's a whole lot out there about what the other person needs to do. And so, you can get that elsewhere. But hopefully some of this will help us even, how do we hold even those notions of what somebody else might need or benefit from? So what gets in the way? I am also for the next month or so, helping co-facilitate a class at a meditation center here in town, and we're really exploring fear. And yesterday was all about impermanence and death. And I don't want to over-focus on that and sort of lose a thread, but I think it's safe to say, or at least one way of contemplating this, and really so much of this is an experiential exploration that any of us can undertake. Much more so than even a theory. It's an invitation to explore this within our own experience. But what gets in the way often is a sometimes very subtle and deep sense of fear. And it might be fear of pain, or fear of suffering, or it might just be fear of uncertainty, fear of not knowing. I recently was reading about some experiment that was trying to assess the relative stress of uncertainty versus pain. And they had people play this video game where you would turn over a rock and on the video game. And some rocks had snakes under them. And if there was a snake, you'd get a little electric shock, like a little buzz. And what they found was stress was higher when there was the greatest amount of uncertainty about whether the next rock would have a snake or not. It was higher than if you were pretty sure you were going to get the snake. So just not knowing is stressful and scary. And what often happens for us as human beings when we're feeling frightened or under stress is that our attention narrows, like behaviorally, if I've read somewhere. I could tell you the book, but it doesn't matter. That if somebody's under, I think the phrase is, and I'm not a behaviorist, so forgive me, but like aversive stimulus control, our attention narrows. And we can't take in much of anything other than what we think will alleviate the perceived threat. And the perceived threat. So it doesn't even necessarily have to be a quote-unquote real threat. If we perceive a threat, that happens, and it's hard to take things in. And we recently had Deb Dana visit Windhorse, who next year is releasing a book on polyvagal theory and psychotherapy. And she's a delight. I'll just give a plug for Deb Dana. But she was talking about in polyvagal theory, there's this idea of neuroception, which is different than perception. So perception might be like if a hungry tiger walks into the room, I will be very frightened. We will all be very frightened. Probably our attention will narrow to, how do I get out of here, or how do I respond? But neuroception could be just that I'm not even conscious of it, but on a pre-conscious nervous system level, that my nervous system is constantly scanning the environment for threat. And if my nervous system feels threatened, I might have a similar response depending on the level of threat, without even being aware of it. And so some of this roughly correlates with a kind of traditional Buddhist perspective of what's called the five skandhas. And let me know if I'm throwing out too much jargon. That wasn't my intention, but it's coming to me. And feel free to say, like, what was that? Or you're losing me. I really don't mind. But that, what's that?
Stimulus.
Yeah, stimulus, right? And it's an alarm, so alarms are designed to be distressing, to be like a baby crying or something. So that's good. We're getting so much help from the community, right? So we could notice what happens in our bodies. And basically, there's a sense that what often happens is a solidified sense of self and other as separate, and then a kind of negotiating, what is my relationship to other? If I like other, I want to pull it in. If I don't like other, I want to push it away. And if I feel kind of neutral about other, I want to tune it out. And again, all of this can happen at a very pre-conscious level. And a lot of the research around implicit bias, that people can think, oh, I'm so enlightened or whatever. I don't have that kind of a response. But then, through tests or whatever kind of research you pick up, no, actually we live in a very prejudiced culture and we are shaped by that. So there's that. And another thing that tends to happen is that our mind is quick to label and fixate concepts, and that can become increasingly rigid the more we feel threatened or distressed. So if somebody feels defensive in an argument, maybe I'm the only person who's felt defensive when I've gotten in an argument, but what can often happen is that we feel increasingly sure that we're right and the other person is wrong, and our mind is building a case, right? And then with all of these things going together, there's this kind of proliferation and escalating, and it's very easy for us, at least momentarily, and sometimes for quite a while, being absorbed in a full-blown drama where everybody has their part and it's airtight, and any information that might actually be in the environment that would contradict it or subvert it, we don't take in. So, Ed Podville had a phrase to describe how this can manifest on a societal level as asylum mentality. That both, not just individually, but culturally, there's a tendency to want to ward off and kind of isolate and control people who bring up discomfort for us, or who we feel threatened by, or who are unpredictable. And you could look at it societally or sociologically in terms of that then gets shaped by who's in power and the dominant group and who makes them feel uncomfortable and so on and so forth. But you can look at institutions like, so historically asylums for people with mental health, prisons, that can be the case, retirement homes. And it's not to vilify all of these situations or to say they don't have their place, but it's not too hard to think about how culturally, to some extent, and there's a whole range there, but to some extent these are the manifestations of a culture trying to contain and control populations that bring up discomfort. So how do we work with that? That we have these tendencies as human beings, perhaps from birth, and then we live in a culture that reinforces them. And if we're stepping into a role where our intention is to be of benefit to others, then it's our responsibility to become aware of those tendencies and to try to find a way to work with them within ourselves, to work with our own mind and heart. And so when Dana came, she speaks a lot in the language of nervous system, and she said it in the sense of, if we're showing up to try to help somebody else regulate or to help co-regulate for somebody else, we really have to take responsibility for regulating ourselves and to find somebody to co-regulate with when we need that. And I would add to that mindfulness practice is a really wonderful tool. That the practice of tuning into the present moment, of using some anchor such as the body breathing, which is a resource we all have as human beings from the moment we have our first cry to the moment we let out our final sigh, that we have the breath as our constant companion. That taking some time each day to tune into some object like that, some aspect of our experience that's embodied and accessible, and to stay with it moment to moment to moment, cultivates that capacity to stay here and to not get totally unseated when something unpredictable comes up or something painful comes up. And then when our mind does wander, as it inevitably does, because that's what mind does and it's not a problem, we can work with touch and go. So we acknowledge that, whether it's a thought, feeling, sensation. We're not ignoring it, because ignoring it or pushing it away would be reinforcing that quality of, oh, I don't like you. Either you're not here or I'm going to get rid of you. So we're not doing that with our thoughts. We're not trying to get rid of thoughts and feelings and sensations. We acknowledge it and then we let go and come back to feeling the breath. So we can acknowledge the siren and let it be. And we can come back to having this talk together. And so the coming back is also exercising the muscle of not just getting caught up with our drama and just letting it run wild. That we're going to say, oh, okay, hello, I recognize you, coming toward me on the street. I'm not ignoring you, and I'm going to let you keep walking. As soon as we're able to, and sometimes that takes a while. But that's why it's called practice. And that's why it's so helpful to have a formal way of doing it that we can then draw on when we're in more complex situations and there's a lot more stimulus. And there's a lot more that's being asked of us. Sitting meditation is very simple. We get to just be with ourselves and make friends with ourselves. And by doing this and relating in this open, acknowledging, friendly way, moment by moment by moment, we increase our capacity that we began with of really welcoming whatever's coming up in our experience. First, in the solitude of sitting meditation, and then out in our lives. And the more we can be a good friend toward within ourselves, the more we can offer that friendliness to others, regardless of what they're going through.